Hi there, and welcome to a new Impact Talks episode. Today we have Francois Kress with us. He's the co-founder and CEO of Feelmore Labs. He's a health tech CEO, but he comes also from the fashion industry, having worked as a president of many companies that we know, like Prada, Bulgari, Fendi, and so on. Today we're going to be talking about his career, but please introduce yourself to the people. Where might they know you from?
Oh, I don't know if they know me from anywhere, but yes, then Francois Kress. I live in New York City. As Lova was saying, I worked for many years in the luxury world and fashion world until switching to the medtech world and trying to do something useful for the world and people at large after selling a lot of beautiful products to people who don't necessarily need them. And that's where I am today. And thank you very much for having me today.
For sure. I looked a little bit into your history and noticed that you studied science and then went into the fashion sphere. Can you kind of go back from the beginning? Why did you study science? How did that passion start? And how do you combine science with fashion, and how come you ended up there?
Yeah, then it seems like a little bit of a tortuous path, but I grew up in France, and in France we have an old educational system which really privileged, at least back then, mathematics. I was really gifted in math, and I followed a path which leads you to, studying mostly math and theoretical physics for a while, specifically 8 years after high school. But that usually leads to any type of careers. You don't necessarily end up working in science or even becoming an engineer. And I really love that beautiful world of theoretical math where everything is so perfect. One thing leading to another, I was basically contacted by Bernard Arnault, the owner and founder of LVMH, which is he's one of the richest guys in the world now, built an empire in luxury and fashion, started, with Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, and I think they have more than 80 brands now. Then he graduated from the same school I did, and I think he was looking for someone who had the same hardwired brain, able to work with concepts, but at the same time I was already an entrepreneur back then because I had my own company after school for a few years, and then we clicked, and I worked for LVMH for nearly 10 years around the world, Europe and Asia mostly, and then the US where I stayed in the past 20 years. Then it was a new field at the time. Luxury was composed of a lot of family-owned businesses, and Bernard Arnault was the first with LVMH to consolidate those family businesses and started building really a global business by acquiring, really beautiful craftsmanship-based companies, but which were still very small at the time and needed funding and expertise to grow. And so that's what I did for 10 years around the world. That's the whole story. And did I use my math background? Probably not. But did I? Does that help? Yeah, you certainly have a certain way of thinking and being able to be very organized mentally, which goes well with fashion, which was not particularly an organized field prior to big conglomerates like LVMH coming in and I would say grow these businesses 100-fold over time from what was mostly an emotional business before, and a family-owned business.
What I really like about the format of this podcast is we have kind of all the time in the world to really dive deeper into what I notice when people get to a certain point in their career, they kind of skate through like, oh, this happened, oh, this guy called, and the story is usually much more fascinating for somebody like me who's kind of in the middle of their career or maybe even starting up. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that beginning where you said you got called up and then you had this small startup a couple of years. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that chapter?
Yes, and if we have the luxury of time, which is great, I will go back to then to schooling I had in France and how it led me to creating a company first. Well, first of all, I'm slightly older. I'm turning 56 this year, and I've been around a while. And we are talking about the late 80s, early 90s in France. I went to a school called École Polytechnique, which was created by Napoleon back in the late 18th century, and which was basically designed to gather the best minds, best scientific and engineering minds in France, put them in a place, put them in a uniform to level up or down their social differences. Then it's a military school, but give them the best scientific and engineering education there is, because at the time Napoleon wanted to build France as, the leading country in terms of infrastructures. Then that was the whole thing, again, back in 1790 something. Then this school still exists. It's actually a school of excellence. We have a lot of Nobel Prizes coming from that school, Fields medals, and the education is provided by exceptional professors. Relatively small, it's 300 students a year, and it's really the elite which is recruited there. It's all through an exam. And then when you finish Polytechnique, you used to owe the French government 10 years of your life because you are paid during your education. It's the opposite of what happens in America. You get the best education, but on top of that, you are paid as a military officer during your 3 years there, and then you owe them 10 years. Then, long story short, did another school which is basically a civil engineering school, which was government also controlled, to end up normally in the higher administration. I didn't really enjoy that. I like science. I like pure science. I was not attracted by applied engineering, if you will. Then I didn't want to spend my career in a predetermined path, like going to a ministry and know already that 3 years later I would go one step up, and therefore evolving, slowly but surely in prestigious positions, but not really. There was not much room for individual, I would say, performance sometimes, or even creativity, which is something I always valued. Then I left the French administration very quickly and started with a friend of mine who came from a business school in France. We created a company to basically use our network of alumni from both our schools to organize seminars and conferences for business people. That was in a very nation kind of a field at the time, space, where you would put together a big panel of like very prestigious people, CEOs, politicians, high administration people, and sell seats to these conferences. Then we did very well for 3 years, sold the company, and to your point, I was really called completely out of the blue by LVMH. I actually received a fax back then. People remember faxes. I was shutting down the company because we sold the assets, which was a portfolio of seminars and conferences. And received a fax.
Can I ask before we continue to the next part of the story? So these events, like how big did it get? And can I ask? I don't know if it's open to share because it's like 40 years ago. But how much was it sold for at the time?
It was pre-euro. Then we are talking French franc, which is about a sixth or a seventh of a current euro. We sold the company at the time. I mean, first of all, entrepreneurship was not valued back then in France, old Europe. Then we were not encouraged. There were no startups. The term didn't exist. It was very rare for someone with my educational background to go into the wilderness, and there were no VCs to raise money from. I think at the time it was called capital risk before VC. It was just, some very few firms would do that. Private equity didn't exist as such either. Then basically you had to go to a bank or to individuals and ask for love money, which still exists, to seed your company. Then it was very small. In the end, I don't remember even what we ended up in terms of turnover, but we were doing about 30 conferences a year, which was pretty significant. We made a name for ourselves, and we were acquired for what was at the time 1 million French franc, which sounded like a lot of money and was a lot of money.
Wait, you completely downplayed this little company that you started. So wait, you started an event company and you got it within a couple of years, or within 2 or 3 years, to 30 conferences a year?
Yeah, we had a team of, we had officers, we had a team of 6 consultants who were each in charge of a bunch of conferences, and we had a huge network. When you graduate from the schools I graduated from in France, you have access to really the highest, most prominent people around. You just put that, you call them, they will pick up the phone and they will do that a favor. At the time, it was very profitable too, because it was contrary to the US, who was much more organized already in the field. People were not asking to be paid to speak at a conference. Then basically our costs were purely renting a room in a beautiful space in Paris, sending a mailer, physical mailer at the time. Although I brought an innovation already then. We attached multiple modems to our old Macs and PCs back then, and we were sending massive faxes, from a database, which was very manual. There were no really software to do that, and I created all that, which was very original. Actually, had a very good conversion rate. Then we did all that, and it worked well, and it attracted attention to some larger companies which were already in the field but couldn't get into this luxury part, and maybe that's where the luxury thing came in. Our conferences were very high level. They were like nobody could gather 20 or 15 speakers of that caliber in one single day in a prestige, or 2 days in Paris. We were selling it for, like, at the time, I think a seat was 5,000 French franc, which would be like 800 euros today. And there was also a thing back then in France where you could, those costs could be covered if you were an employee of a corporation by a tax deductible, advantage that the company would get. And it didn't cost anything to the company. Then we benefited from that too. And then we had up to hundreds of people attending the conference, paying. Then it was a highly profitable business, and then some of the conferences became, even in the space of 3 years, recurring. We had topics like private labels for the large, hypermarket distributions. They were at the time when they were starting to create their own products, their own branding. Then we had very prominent people involved. It was very interesting. And then we did the same every year with different people speaking, or some of the same. And again, we sold it for like 1 million French francs at the end, which seems like nothing today, but for us was obviously a lot of money. And then again, really coincidentally, at the very end of that, I got a fax from LVMH saying, would you like to talk to us? We like the fact that you come from that school and you have an entrepreneurial background, which was very rare, combined back then.
Did you know them already, or were they at your conference? Were they sponsors?
No, they never participated. We are much more like dealing with big box marketing companies. Luxury was not, luxury was a very impressive thing. I didn't come from a family with tons of money, and we're not consumers of luxury. You would walk past those big, impressive stores, which at the time were much less welcoming than today. You had to have the money to enter a Louis Vuitton shop, and there were many less stores too, and they were all concentrated in very expensive places like Rue de la Paix or Place Vendôme in Paris. I mean, places where you knew you were not welcome, basically. Then it was very impressive. It was very attractive to me because I always liked, beautiful things, and this notion of perfection, which probably clicks well with my taste for math and stuff like that. So there is something in luxury which obviously is above the masses. It's something very ideal. The products are beautifully made, and distribution is very exclusive. Then that's obviously, and LVMH was in the press at the time because Bernard Arnault made a coup, by acquiring Louis Vuitton and all that stuff. And he was known, but I didn't know that I didn't have any personal contacts with them at all prior to this connection and request. Yeah.
So before this call popped up, the timing seemed so well timed. Did they know that you got acquired? Were they the ones who acquired you? Like, how was the timing so good?
No, and that tells you that sometimes in life, luck plays a role. I think it's sheer luck. I don't think anybody I knew recommended me. I think they just browsed maybe the alumni, list and saw that I was doing something interesting. But we were not like in the press front and center as an example, because again, we are not very anecdotal in the French landscape back then. So I don't think, I really think, it's a good question, which I never resolved, but I think it was pure timing and luck. And I picked up these facts that I could have ignored, and I went there and I pursued that, which is also a big part of my story. I have taken risks, because the main thing I could have done, and most people would have done then, was have to join like an investment banking firm or a consulting firm. I did a year internship when I was still back at school at what was called the Mac Group at the time, which was like a direct competitor of McKinsey. It was a Cambridge, Massachusetts-based consulting firms, and I already dipped my toes into, management consulting, which was very, very fashionable back then. You had beautiful career, expected a lot of, people from my school went there, or it was the beginning of investment banking. There were plenty of careers of choice I could have gone to, and going to LVMH was actually also a risk. It looks very easy as a decision today and a choice, but historically, besides Bernard Arnault himself, who was the owner and the founder, there were maybe another guy from my school working there. It was not a natural choice at all. Yeah.
Before, because I want to ask that also when you enter, like how big it was. Before I have one last question, which is, you said at one point you're wrapping up this company. So you're doing now 30 conferences, and then somebody comes to you because they found you or something, and then they acquired the company. Two questions there. How did they find you? What was this company? And then how is the process of getting acquired if you have like these multiple events, conferences? It's very rare that an event gets acquired. So as a business, it must have been structured quite smart. Otherwise, they wouldn't have offered.
Yeah, I mean, that's again, it's very long ago, but we had an original investor, and I'm not going to name names here because these people are still around. We had an initial investor who I think put not tons of money. You probably put 100,000 French francs to get it started back then. And this guy was very connected, and he brought the acquirer 3 years later, and the deal was structured in a way that the consultants, which were each in charge, I was also doing it, and my partner as well, but co-founder as well, but the consultant would stay on board for a couple of years just to carry on those events. Some were already established. Obviously, what they were losing by losing me and my co-founder was the fact that we had often a direct connection with speakers, but they bet on the fact that the reputation of the brand was already such, and themselves, the acquirer, were in the field of like financial information, if you will, would have enough pool as well. Then it was an extension of what they were already doing, which was financial news. Then they thought it was a natural extension. I think they already have like an event structure, but again for like much smaller events and less prestigious. And I think it was just acquiring a luxury. Then they had the mechanism, they had connection through their publications and existing things. Then it was a step up for them, and they changed the brand, by the way, also right after. I don't know what happened to all that, honestly, because I started moving abroad very quickly after. Then even 10 years later, I don't know what happened. It was absorbed, then the idea was to be completely absorbed, even brand-wise, into their existing structure for events.
How funny, because in the Netherlands a couple of years ago, the Next Web, which is this huge festival, tech festival for startups, it also got acquired, and it also got acquired by the Financial Times.
Okay.
So just very funny. That's what I wanted to ask. Okay, but then so now you get the call, you get the facts, you take the risk. When you walk in, how big is the company? Because you make it sound like it was a small company at the time. Or like how was the beginning?
Yeah, everything is relative, obviously. And you're talking about LVMH, right?
Yeah.
LVMH was small relative to what it is today. but it was already a big firm. It was not the number one on the CAC 40, you know, which is the stock exchange index in France, but it was already growing. It had Louis Vuitton, which was a cash cow and has remained. I think there hasn't been a single year since the inception that Louis Vuitton hasn't grown by double digit. Then that was already a significant. First of all, they own most of the brands which mattered. I mean, except Hermes and Chanel, which historically have stayed with their families. They owned, you know, Louis Vuitton, number one in the world by far in size. They own Christian Dior. They own the champagnes, Moet Hennessy. They own some liquors. I mean, they own like already probably like 40 brands in the field between fashion, luxury, jewelry, and they just acquired. No, they did that while I was there, but they acquired also distribution ventures like DFS, duty-free shoppers that you may have seen in airports around the world, and they were already, the footprint was big. Yeah.
So you enter. How was the interview? Like, what convinced you to go into an industry that you were quite strange with?
I was young first. I mean, you know, I have very little experience. Spent most of my life studying at this consulting experience plus my own company, which is not really learning from others. Then I was quite naive, probably. I interviewed first with their HR, head of HR at the time, was a big, very known personality who participated to the creation of LVMH2, very close to Bernard Arnault. And then I interviewed with Bernard Arnault. And then basically the project was, they acquired, if you are familiar in Paris, there is a department store called Le Bon Marché on the left bank, which is the oldest department store in the world. It was the first one to define this concept. Beautiful store, but there was only one door, basically, in Paris, very sophisticated. And Bernard Arnault, at the time, was eyeing DFS for an acquisition and said, I want to build Le Bon Marché internationally. I want to go global with this concept. I have this beautiful jewel in my portfolio, which is one of the most sophisticated department stores in the world. Let's try it. Let's do a test in Saipan. I don't know if you know where Saipan is. It's near Guam. Guam may be more familiar. It's in the northern Marianas Island, which is it's U.S. territory. Saipan is a small island. It's 3 hours south of Tokyo, basically. It was historically German, Japanese, American over the years. It has been American since World War II. And Saipan and Guam are still like a mini Hawaii for Japanese tourists to go shopping. It's duty free for them. Then the price of luxury goods is about 40% below Japan, domestic market. Then people would just go for a weekend, 3-hour flight, which is usually paid by duty-free shoppers. Duty-free shoppers started after World War II and basically set up on those islands. Then they literally own the island. You couldn't make a step. At the airport, it's all DFS, in town, everywhere. Then Japanese tourists would be put on planes willingly, flown to Guam or Saipan and spend the weekend shopping and go back home, and they would shop for their friends and family because they would get such a good deal on all the brands. Then Arnault said, I want to compete with DFS. Let's put our first Bon Marché on the island of Saipan, which is very tropical, and let's hire this guy, me, to do it. I had no international experience. I barely spoke English. Then I was very attracted. It was very attractive as a proposition, you know, for me. I didn't know anything about like commerce, basically, you know, running leadership. I exercised my leadership skills on my startup, and I also spent a year in the French army as an officer in the commando paratroopers, and I had a bunch of soldiers under me, and I knew I could manage people. But that was a stretch, and the language barrier, the cultural barrier was a stretch too. And it got me very excited because I'm someone who likes challenges. I like challenges. And first, the glamour of LVMH, plus a project where I would go, and at the time, by the way, I already had 2 kids, a third in the way, in spite of my young age. And he said, okay, take your entire family there, set up on that island, and build me a store and make it work. then for me it was like a pioneer kind of like proposal, which I couldn't refuse.
How like does that work with your partner? Like that's it? Like just quit, come with me, and
the good news that she was not really working at the time because we had a lot of kids back to back. So that was great. And she was the daughter of a Navy officer, and she moved around a lot. She was born in Madagascar when her father was posted there. And for her, it was as exciting as for me. And for the kids, for me, it was always a fantastic opportunity for kids, whatever age they are, to move around, you know. Then just started at Le Bon Marché under I didn't work directly, I mean, directly for Bernard Arnault, but also under the CEO of Le Bon Marché at the time. And they flew me out with my family to Saipan, and you had to fly to Japan first, to Tokyo, take another flight to Saipan. It was very exotic. I didn't know any of that. With two little kids, one on the way, who was born there, by the way. And then spend not long, it was a year and some, to build a store, which I had to recruit people in the Philippines, in Japan, because the local resources were not there, especially salespeople needed to be native Japanese. Japanese tourists at the time would not necessarily purchase from non-Japanese salespeople. Then we had to build the whole thing, which was a great experience for me. And then the funny part is that commercially, it didn't work at all. For one reason is that was maybe the French arrogance to think that we could come to an island like that, bring products. Then we had two issues. The first one, I don't think the knowledge of the Japanese duty-free Japanese customer was sufficient. The second thing is that most of the brands they wanted, LVMH couldn't necessarily get them, because when they wanted to go, DFS already had a ton of footprint and real estate on the islands, and they were very well supplied in all the big brands, French inclusive, like Chanel, Hermes, everybody else, which was non-LVMH, which would obviously boycott LVMH. Then we ended up building a beautiful store, which was really a mini replica of the Bon Marché, which was built, by the way, by Gustave Eiffel in Paris. And it's beautiful architecture. You recognize many details of the Eiffel Tower there. We did that on a tropical island. Saipan made no sense. Spent a lot of money building a beautiful store that I don't think anybody was sensitive to that. And we could, unfortunately, the merchandising was not as broad as we wanted because we were not, we didn't have access to all the brands we wanted. And also DFS literally at the time owned their customers from Japan already. They were booking the trip for them. They were like paying for accommodation. They had already vouchers in their hands. They were put on buses as soon as they landed to go to DFS. We didn't have these resources. We tried and we built that. But the whole intention in the end was for LVMH to acquire DFS. That was in the background. Then the fact that we went on their territory, built a store, made some noise, created some business was enough for them to sell to Arnault. While at the end of my stay there, and they acquired all the assets of this Bon Marché we built in Saipan. We were about to build the second one in Guam, but then the project stopped there after a year and a half with a big acquisition for LVMH, which allowed them to basically control duty-free distribution all over Asia, which was a brilliant move from Arnault. Realizing that he couldn't build it himself, even with a beautiful name as the Bon Marché, which was not recognized abroad. It would have taken decades. Much easier to buy the main competitor. Then we did that, and I moved back to France, where my next step was then with Louis Vuitton, which was obviously the leading brand of LVMH. Then during my Saipan adventures, I met most of the CEOs of LVMH of brands, because there was Bernard Arnault, obviously chairman and owner, and each brand had its own CEO. And the CEO of Louis Vuitton at the time, who is unfortunately passed away since, Yves Carcel, was also from Polytechnique, same school. He was another acquisition from Arnault, and he was obviously older than me, but we clicked very well. Then he said, when you are done with this project, come work with me at Louis Vuitton. Then again, a little bit of luck and also building a relationship, and I think he appreciated me and my work, and he was a great leader. Then I joined Louis Vuitton, And that's where really my more stable career, I would say, in luxury and fashion started.
When you're telling your story, the only thing I'm thinking is you must be extremely charismatic in those conversations, because obviously young, inexperienced from what I'm gathering from your story, and Arnault is trusting you with such a big project, and then somehow you get it done, like to the goal that he actually wanted to achieve. But then also one of the biggest brands in his portfolio wants them to like work with, like that you work with them. Like what are these conversations that you're having them that build so much trust in you? Does a couple of conversations stand out maybe?
That's interesting, yeah, that you say that. I mean, first of all, I was young, and as many people in their youth, I was very confident in my skills. I was not over-promising, but I didn't think, which I learned the hard way at times, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that was maybe delusional, but I thought that nothing was too big for me, as long as I was interested. Then, okay, that's a sign of immaturity, but that helped me probably reflect some confidence, not overly. I was always honest about what I knew and what I didn't know. And I still, to this day, even as an older guy, I have a taste for risk. I mean, I like risky stuff. I like difficult stuff. I like to solve difficult problems. I have been offered many times easier jobs where the money would have been easier to make, more safe. They have never excited me as much as difficult. And the challenge is a driver, and maybe people like that and feel that in those conversations. I don't recall exactly conversation. I think, yes, I probably had something which I've noticed over the years that allow me also to be, I can say, I think confidently these days, that I'm a very solid manager and leader of organization, big and small, because I've done that in every country. I mean, so many countries around the world, cultures and diversity. I think it clicks, usually. I don't have only friends, obviously I have some enemies too, but overall, it has always worked. Yes, there is this level of trust. I can deliver. I'm extremely reliable also. I think people feel that rapidly. And if I say something or do something, I won't just ignore it. I usually follow through extremely well. Or if I can't, I will be very honest about it. I think there is a transparency that people appreciate. And I'm not completely stupid, I guess, which helped also along the way. But here we go.
The reason I'm asking that question is because a lot of people have lost their jobs during the pandemic and everything, but also in general, they might get stuck in their jobs. They feel like they deserve more, and they seem to not gain that trust that you've had in quite a corporate structure, obviously, because many brands, family brands, historical brands, so you'd think quite intense with the structure. What kind of tips would you give them? Because obviously right now you've been pretty vague with I've been reliable, this, that, what most people would consider themselves, but you've hired people, you've had teams. How would you pick out a person like that? How would you take the same risk on the person? What are you looking for, and what can people do themselves?
That's a question, and I've been also I've been trying to help younger people when they come to me asking me this question. It's difficult. I mean, for me, it was honestly a combination of having probably the most prestigious diploma you can get in France. And because most of these companies at the beginning, up to LVMH at least, were French companies or even European companies, that already adds you a little plus. They look at it, he was one of the happy few who were smart enough, hardworking enough to get into that school. That means something. Then even if it's not true, they are branded, from it's very European, and some, Ivy League schools in the US too. You always look at a Harvard MBA guy or a Stanford MBA differently than you look at others. And that for me was definitely an unfair advantage from the get-go. Then after that, it's very hard to say, because it's like when people say, how do you become a good leader? How do you become a good manager? I think there is a acquired wiring that you have or you don't. I mean, it's very true. I've seen a lot of people desperately trying to better themselves and become better managers, but they didn't have it. And often it feels very artificial and it didn't really work. And you can get better at many things, but there are like some fundamentals like that which are really hard to acquire. And I think it's all about knowing yourself. What are you really good at? I know we tend to tell people, especially in this country where I live, follow your dream, you can be anything you want as long as you want. It's not true, right? It's really not true. It's great to follow your dreams, but you cannot be anything you want to be. You have to quickly know yourself, your strengths, and play in it. You can try to improve your weaknesses, which is great, but the effort you have to put in that, and the chances of success are so limited compared to growing your strengths and exploiting them and displaying them. Then the best advice is like identify your strengths and don't listen too much to people telling you, oh, you are not good at this and that, you should work on it. Yes, maybe, but really use your strengths first, because there's a point in life where you are like, you are what you are, and everybody can be great at something for sure, or most, but don't try to be great at what you cannot be great at. That's the biggest mistake people make. They want to be an entrepreneur because they see entrepreneur being successful. It's not for everyone. They want to be a CEO because they see great CEOs. Not everybody wants or can be a great CEO. Then find your path. Yeah, that's really my favorite.
I probably will add to that as I go through my own story. Having tried so many things, I think in the beginning when you don't know, you have to try everything. But then as you go through life, you start discovering these strengths. And I notice people on the podcast who are also extremely successful, then keep mentioning the fact that, don't waste your time with the weaknesses, because if you just focus on the strengths, let's say you're a bad leader, but you're like amazing at this one skill, like coding. You could literally become a millionaire just doing that as an employee. And you'd be, exponentially more successful by just focusing on this one strength. So as I grow, I definitely follow that advice. But I want to skip a little bit through your career. You've had a lot of these president, CEO positions, so I don't want to go through all of them. But just like which ones stand out? And I guess my main question is, which ones stand out and learning lessons wise that you now get to apply in entrepreneurship?
Then I would say the longest and best learnings came definitely from LVMH, which actually was the only French company I worked for, because it was the most structured one, where my bosses at the time were for most of them really people I respected, who could teach me something. Then after that, because I built my path and reputation at LVMH, I was more invited to join than still family-based companies and a bunch of Italian ones, where the structure was not as strong. The talent was there, enormous talent. Would that be Bulgarian jewelry, Prada in pure fashion, and I had always a huge admiration for Prada for the creativity and the art kind of background of that brand. Then I would say the first phase I learned really management, structuring, how to grow brands from a very organized and rational way with LVMH, more like maybe the French way. Then I moved to these Italian brands, which were much more, depending where they were, because I had Roman brands, Milanese brands, there's already a difference culturally. Then where definitely design, creativity was at the forefront of everything they were doing, and maybe sometimes they were not as strong as business people, family owned, again, multi-generational often. Then that's where I learned the other side, which really I didn't learn at school. Creativity. What is design creativity? How do you make beautiful products? How do you feel what the market wants? Because again, luxury and fashion at that level of luxury, they are not based at all. That's the exact opposite of what you hear from any startup and VC. They are not based on customers' feedback at all. On the contrary, what you learn in luxury fashion from the get-go is don't listen to your customers ever. They are going to make your brand mediocre, It's not like a user UX type of approach, that's not the way. It's a push strategy. You have geniuses designing products. You have usually a creative director, would that be family or acquired? And these people have a vision. They know or they feel that their creativity is strong enough to create a demand. That's a completely reverse approach. And I think I learned that, especially with those more creative Italian brands over time, that this push was so powerful that a brand could become gigantic like Prada, just out of the creativity of Miuccia Prada, who is a granddaughter of the founder and has been there for a long time and is a creative force. She has a vision. The vision goes from how the stores look to the... It is not based from like, surveys of customers. And why? Because luxury is not about functionality, right? It's not about why would you buy a 30,000 euro handbag when you could carry your stuff from A to B in a plastic bag, or maybe a paper bag would be more appropriate today. So that's the same functionality. In the end, you want it because it says something about you, because you find satisfaction in the quality, the beauty, etc., etc. But you also find satisfaction in the social aspect of it. Then there is a lot of learning there, which I really acquired more and more over time, going through the experiences. Prada was probably the best and remains the best in my eyes in terms of being purely driven by creativity and strong business sense. Obviously, you don't become a multi-billion-dollar company if you don't have a strong business sense, but it was dominated first and foremost. Everything was created by aesthetic. Everything was driven by aesthetic.
I want to we have to dive deeper into the two things you mentioned. Your time before Prada, where you said, I learned how to build a brand. I think LVMH, you learn how to build a brand and just do it in a rational way. I think this is like a massive learning lesson that a lot of our audience can use. And then later I will dive also your time at Prada and like how you learned creativity, and I think the most important part was the what the market wants type of situation, because a lot of people are geniuses, creative geniuses, but like are broke. so like so many things I want to cover, but let's start kind of again chronologically. So building brands rationally, you have an incredible insight in this looking at your career. Can you please elaborate what the structure was and like what you learned exactly?
Yes, and unfortunately, I won't provide a recipe for, as you said, the broke creative geniuses to suddenly become millionaires, because unfortunately, it stops at a point where it works or it doesn't. But once you have, and again, the brands, most LVMH brands were between 50 to 100 to 150-year-old. Then they already had, and that's the genius of LVMH too, they never tried to start something from scratch. They always acquired existing brands because most, at least, of the reputational work is done. But when I say the rational approach is an absolute drastic discipline in controlling your brand. And I go back to the times of the 90s where internet was not in the way, thank God, at the time, because your growth was coming exclusively from retail distribution, your own stores, and wholesale distribution selling from third-party retailers, but all brick and mortar. Then the brick and mortar experience was extraordinarily controlled in the sense, especially Louis Vuitton. Louis Vuitton didn't have any wholesale distribution. Then that's the epitome of what a brand can be when they have the means to be that way. Then huge, incredible margins, great volumes, great growth, and they could afford it. Then meaning they never sold a single product outside their own network of stores. Then every store was formatted in a way. There was no different from one store to another. The salespeople were trained exactly the same way around the world. Everything, those brands have to have a complete, total integrity globally. Then, and every product was the whole manufacturing, or most of the manufacturing at the time, belonged to LVMH. Then the quality control was impeccable. Most 99% of the product were made in France, and the label was respected. There is a temptation for many brands, and a lot of American brands have followed that temptation, which made them non-luxury, maybe very big, very fast, but lost the sheen, if you will, because they started immediately licensing, distributing outrageously outside their own network just to, show incredible growth. Then a big lesson is that growth could be your worst enemy in luxury and in building a proper brand. And when I say the type of brand I'm talking about are not brands that you want to flip in 3 years through VC investments, which is a completely different thing. I'm talking of brands that you want to pass on to your children and will be there 200 years from now. It's a different approach because it's a costly approach. It's an approach where you control your growth and you limit your growth in favor of brand integrity. And then everything else goes from communication, PR. You have to create a brand which is unreachable. I mean, these things are changing today. Internet, social media, different demand from the younger generation. But back then, those brands were aspirational. They were something ideal. You wanted everybody in some countries would save money just to acquire a little piece of the brand because socially it elevates you. Then all these pictures were already very idealized people, beautifully shot by very expensive photographers, glossy magazines. You would not see usually typically spots on TV. Everything was really controlled and always projecting an ideal vision of the brands. And it's never about promoting the practical benefits of your product. Luxury brands are not practical. It's to project a dream. Price is never an issue. Then consistently, luxury brands have increased their prices every year by often a double digit over the past 30 years. Then prices have probably tripled over the past 20 years easily. And it works. It's not price sensitive in that way. It creates more demands. And basically all the traditional rules of marketing, you can bin them when it comes to luxury. And you have to rethink that within the mindset that your brand dominates. Your brand is dictating all the aspects, that be price, aesthetic, distribution. You had to make an effort to see this product. You had to go to specific stores, and there were not that many. There were probably 2 Louis Vuitton stores in Paris back then. Then you had to go wait in line, etc. etc. Then it's always keeping the brand having the upper hand over the consumer who are respecting and idealizing and worshipping the brand. That's what luxury is about.
You mentioned it's different nowadays. How do you see it being different nowadays?
It's different because it's more accessible than all these brands. They reluctantly, because I was there when it started changing, they came very late to the game of e-commerce, most of them. First, most of them with their own e-commerce and starting to sell through third-party distribution too, because they saw the unavoidability of it, and they also saw that their traditional brick and mortar, with some exception, was not as performing, especially in traditional markets. And they were very lucky to get mainland China coming up with obviously a big middle class rising, which would love those European brands. Then there have been transfers of things, but culturally in the more mature markets like Europe and the US, there is a different level of demand today. First of all, again, accessibility, social media, more transparency. It's less about glossy magazines, idealized, beautiful people, although it's still the game, but it has to be closer to people's real life. Diversity, sustainability. They realize also that luxury is polluting like everybody else. Then how do you... Leather goods. Leather is a terribly polluting industry, tanning and all that stuff, and you have to kill animals on the way. Then all that is more at the forefront. The luxury mining, diamond mining, there were wars involved and blood diamonds. All that has been much more regulated, and people felt that from a PR standpoint, they had to react to that. Then all that has come much more it didn't exist, barely existed in the 80s and 90s. It was whatever, people would literally die to get a product. Now it's more critical. and brands have to be more open and probably closer to people. And does that mean that they are listening more to their customer? Probably in social terms, maybe not in product terms, but in social terms for sure. Then it changes the dynamic.
When you're explaining this to me, I didn't realize this somehow, but when you're explaining like the philosophy, but also how people reacted to those brands, it seems to me like the shift has changed the way from these leather materialistic goods to technology. Like people would literally kill themselves to get the latest iPhone before everybody else, sleep in like so somehow it shifted away from just like an object that technically is not very useful, like you said, like you can have a plastic bag, to something that makes you like a cyborg, makes you faster, go on the internet, tap into like the human collective and stuff like that. So it seems like it didn't vanish, it just moved to a different industry.
Absolutely true. And to that point, you mentioned the perfect example of a tech brand which probably instinctively, because of the founder, the nature of the founder was a genius, followed the rules of the luxury industry. I mean, Apple was design driven, perfection driven, beyond reason and beyond functionality. You know, it's like when you compare like Porsche to, I don't know, Toyota or Lexus. Some are functional, they have all the safety features there, and one is more glamorous, probably has less good features, but it's a different attraction. Well, Apple versus Samsung, for instance, you see that very well. I mean, at least back in the day, and created those exactly the same desirability, plus obviously all the perks, because now you can use, which luxury could never do. I mean, besides maybe timepieces, you know, watches, very sophisticated watches was a specific part of luxury, because at least it was giving time, one functionality. But then technology, you absolutely had the potential to do that, but because technology was usually managed by engineers and people who were mostly functionality driven, they didn't capture this potential except really Apple. And now many, you could say like Peloton have some part of that too. I mean, you can find more recent examples with up and downs, but as soon as you put your brand before everything else, as Apple did, you can see this shift happening between being just a very great, profitable, practical brand and being an actual brand with luxury qualities.
Yeah. And it's like in the beginning, they were just like these motherboards that they were selling, and then they got money, and that's when Steve Jobs was like, no, design is everything. Yeah, that I didn't even make that parallel until I had this conversation. How much he sounds like the granddaughter of Prada, which you said, like just this genius, design driven. So it's like you won't find that more, because you try to look in the tech sector who is like Steve Jobs, but actually you should be looking at the luxury sector, and then it completely makes sense that Apple is so expensive, that they're doing, yeah, very.
And Apple, by the way, in the past 10 years, although they stopped recently, but they hired a bunch of ex-luxury fashion executives to work on their stores, especially in their experience, because they completely understood that these people knew how to preserve a brand equity. And I think it worked out well.
That's so cool. Especially because then you know where to look for examples of how it got done, and also how to build a company that goes to your children versus the culture nowadays where let's build a company that becomes $1 billion. But it also eventually leads to billions of dollars. But so then we move on to like the creativity part. You learned like structure, you learned like what is necessary to build this 100-year-old brand, and then you go to Prada and you're learning about creativity, one of the hardest skills to learn. What were you, especially science-based, probably you've analyzed these things, what stands out? How did you learn this creativity that you can apply to yourself?
Then yes, and I said earlier that there are some things in life which are harder to acquire than others, like leadership. Well, being creative, especially when it comes to like aesthetic and visual, even worse. You know, that one you can probably learn to draw better. You can probably learn how to, you know, do things technically, but like taste is so relative and so decided also by some elites. And it's even harder to quantify or put processes on that. In the position I was at Prada, I was running the Americas for the 3 brands they had at the time. I was not, and probably better for them, not directly involved in the creative process for the product because I know myself. I think I have a keen eye and can recognize also after 25 years in the same industry a product with potential versus not, but I still make mistakes. And what was fascinating is to see that some people are really maybe totally irrational in their everyday approach, are not able to follow a process, but they have that very specific thing, which if you can get that, and if you can get that in your company, whatever you do, where if you have a need for branding, to have this little creative genius, which is someone with a strong vision, visceral vision of what needs to be done, even if they cannot express it in coherent words, but they can produce the aesthetic. And especially it's so visceral for them that they have to stick to it, like probably Steve Jobs was feeling about Apple. It becomes, and these people are hard to manage. These people are temperamental. These people are rough because they can't understand why you don't see what they see. It's like a completely different wiring, and it's being close and working with people like that who then provide really the ammunition, they provide the fuel for your company to grow. And then you need technical people to make the product, to run your factories, and then people to distribute that. But without that first and creative input and the consistency of it, you are nothing. At least in those more creative industries. And the learnings were more like, how do you work with these people? How do you still direct them somewhat? Because you still know what price point you will sell. You still know what, some very convoluted garments could be beautiful on the runway, but nobody would buy them in the end because they are not wearable. It happens a lot. How do you temper that? How do you balance that? How do you direct the merchandising? Because, I still need black pants, because I know I will sell a lot, but I need a few crazy dresses on the runway just for the brand image, reputations, building the dream. Then it's more like, as a very rational person who can do like math, advanced topology proof, how do I deal with these people without trying to convert them to my church, which they will never understand because they don't function like that. They don't function in linear processes. You and I can probably relate in many things because you are more from the tech side too. Then you understand what a process is. You understand that lines of code won't work if you make a mistake, right? These guys are not like that. They live in it's more, for most of them, it's more like in a cloud of creativity and an impulse, very sensitive, very emotional people. Then how do you balance both is actually a great learning. And most people in the tech world never have to do that because they are mostly all tech driven. And it's probably enough to make great product, especially software based, which will represent a ton of money. If the ambition of people is to make a lot of money, there are many faster ways and safer ways to make money today than trying to start a luxury brand. But the learnings are quite amazing because they still apply in some capacity to many other things. And you can have, even when you launch a SaaS software, you can have a better branding when you have the creativity involved than if you just, pull a logo out of a quick, freelancer and call it a day. Then, yeah.
It almost feels to me like, from the stories you're telling me, if you want to make a lot of money, sure, go start a company, right? But if you want to build a legacy, then you almost have to be like these luxury brands.
Yeah. I mean, no, that's true. I mean, longevity definitely comes more from the brand value and brand visibility and brand and respect for the brand, which is built slowly. The way people's brains on the market absorb those and respect them, the time factor is unavoidable. You can't build. There have been attempts. There were interesting ones. There was I don't know if you remember that. Must have been in the early 2000s. A brand called Asprey, which was a brand which was doing jewelry for the Queen of England. Small, beautiful, mostly jewelry-based brand out of the UK. suddenly got acquired by these private equity guys who said, we are going to build a new Hermes overnight. Then hired the best designers, made every category of product you can imagine, booked crazy real estate on Fifth Avenue and other places around the world, giant stores, put all these categories. It looks beautiful. Hired all the staff they could find from competitors, and it crashed in less than a year because you cannot appear out of nowhere on the market with all the codes of luxury without the time factor, which has built generational trust, desire. Oh, I remember my grandmother had an Hermes Cis, therefore it's part of the blood. Then, and that's totally incompatible with the VC world of today, obviously, where time has to be shrunk, and the shorter the better. Those are almost the longer the better, with some exceptions. But it's really the name of the game is patience, controlled growth, and controlled branding.
One last question about this part of your story, which is you said it's very hard to deal with these people, but I learned like specific types of ways. For somebody who usually doesn't deal with those type of people, what are some tips? How do you deal with such creative geniuses in a way that is positive for both?
Yeah, then confrontation is the worst thing you can do, usually because of how much is put on their shoulders. Those very creative people, they have to be reassured constantly that they are amazing. It's part of the deal. I mean, we are all a little bit like that, but for them it's really amplified. Then it's always, confrontation, rational talking, all that doesn't really work, with exception again. But for most, it's all about being in a zone of trust and confidence, and you have to take risk, and you have to let them run loose sometimes at the risk of, not every product they're gonna make is gonna sell, but if you frustrate them, you are taking a much bigger risk than by letting them make mistakes. Then it's slow, subtle direction, guiding them, not trying to do that in a rational way too much, because that's not what sticks. It has a lot to do with ego. It has a lot to do with trust and feeling comfortable in their positions, and they are not being challenged, and they are not being annoyed by commercial consideration, although they know obviously the money has to come from somewhere. But then it's a very subtle move, and you have to be their friend while keeping a little bit of a strength, a tight grip, but certainly not confrontational. I've never seen good coming out of confrontation with a designer.
Interesting. Okay, so then finally, after an hour, what do you do now? How are you applying those skills? How did you end up starting your own company?
That's a bit of a process. And let's move back to 2010. I was still running Prada at the time, and I was invited again, I'd say the second time in my life, where this fax, which was not a fax at the time, but is like completely coincidental, unexpected, I don't even know where it came from, offer came to me, which was to sit on the board of a biotech company, which was probably Series C startup at the time, but very, very well funded by very prominent medtech or biotech VCs. The company was called Kythera Biopharmaceuticals. They were out in California, met with a headhunter, then met with all the board members at the time, and they all said, okay, he's our guys. They had been looking for a while for someone from they started with the cosmetic industry, and I don't know much. I mean, I've never worked in cosmetic, which is like in sandwich between, I would say, mass product and pure luxury. They were building an injection product for the double chin, then molecules, and you inject in the chin. Obviously, it was under FDA reviews. They needed all approval, and it would be prescribed by dermatologists and plastic surgeon. Inject in the chin, 2 or 3 sessions, and your double chin disappears. Then super alluring proposal, because the only alternative before was to surgeries and to cut off the extra skin, which is not obviously very user-friendly. Then when I end up on that board, first contact of my life with VCs. Most of the board members were VCs, who were invested in the company. Great CEO, who came from the pharmaceutical industry. Then I didn't understand the science. I didn't understand what VCs were talking about. Then it was like drinking of a fire hose for me, and a complete reset of my notion of business from sitting on boards of like family owned or, again, long cycle companies preserving a brand and not talking about those very quick, are we doing an IPO? When is the next round? Should we take debt or equity funding? Then it's, I learned a lot. I learned about the science, which was pure science, biochemistry, which was really interesting too for me. And I think they also put me on that board because I had my scientific educations and I was able to understand what they were talking about while bringing them. They wanted to position it as an expensive, aesthetic product, and they wanted to understand how. Then in the 5 years I sat on this board, we went through different stages of financing, one IPO, and then FDA approvals. And perfect trifecta. I was obviously a very lucky, how do you say that, like beginner's luck. Usually it doesn't happen like that for FDA-based product, but this one went through everything, like flying through. And we sold the company for 2.1 billion to Allergan, which with the maker of Botox. Then it was a very natural move for Botox to also have a product. The product still exists. It's called Kybella. And the rest is history. Then I obviously was lucky enough to make some money out of this transaction. I also was even luckier to meet and become really friends with some of the VCs, especially one of our current investors, who said, if you ever want to start something in a more like technical field, let me know. And then from 2015, it took me a year to figure that out. Then in 2016, we started, it already started actually, and that specific investor from Arch Venture was already involved with a company which just started but was probably not going in the right direction. It was more like a research project, and he thought that he would put more money if I got involved, and one thing leading into another, I took over the project. And that's how I ended up. For me, I was suffering a bit from fashion luxury fatigue after 25 years. The world had changed considerably, as I said earlier. The dynamic was much less about, especially if you're not working for one of the very big players, which I was not at the time. I wanted to stay in the US. There are less global brands based in the US, and I ended up running smaller fashion brands. And the growing those brands was nearly impossible without massive funding, which didn't really exist, etc., etc. Then, and intellectually, I was not, after especially the Kythera experience on that board, I was less excited by the problematics of smaller fashion brands versus potentially building a product which helps people. We're going to get there, using technology, reading scientific papers, and building a very hybrid team of scientists, neuroscientists, engineers, marketers, and trying to build a product, a brand, out of basically an assumption. I mean, it was super exciting to me. Then I needed a renewed excitement, got the funding from the get-go. Then, here we go 5 years later now.
So can you tell me what are some of the flagship products that, for the audience, like, please explore more. How is the building of the company, assembling of the team, first products, that type of stuff?
Then we started from science, which emanated from Harvard Medical School and MIT, which says, and it seems obvious, but when you interact with the skin in a mechanical way, it does something to your brain, and potentially you can we could exploit it in a very targeted way. Obviously, it's not random. Interaction creates some specific reaction from the brain, but the idea was, first we could maybe reach the vagus nerve. You may have heard of the vagus nerve. That's the longest cranial nerve, which has many branches and connects your brain to most of your organs, and it's kind of this highway of communication, and has been the holy grail of many neuromodulation technologies. That's the technical term of what we do. Vibrating on the skin externally doesn't seem to allow to really hit the vagus nerves. And for 2 years, it was trial and error. Then we developed tons of prototypes, brought thousands of people in our lab back in Boston at the time and just tested EEG tests, questionnaires, pupillography. I mean, any kind of technique which tells you what happens when you do something to someone. And through both our research team being very savvy and experiment, we narrowed down a specific vibration or a specific family of vibration, which actually triggered, and we see that in fMRI studies, EEG studies, all that is posted on our website, which shows that by vibrating with this specific pattern on the skin, a certain part of your brain called the insular cortex, very deep in your brain, interacts with other parts of the brain, and that's the part which modulates your emotions. That's the part which modulates your anxiety. Then we demonstrated through all these studies, as much as you can demonstrate something in neuroscience, it's not math, but we demonstrated with enough certainty that those vibrations, very specific one which we patented and we kind of own them, have the ability to reduce your anxiety, which and improve some communication between your brain and your body, which basically allows you to sleep better. And moreover, over time, by using this technology every day for 20 minutes, which is the average user requirement, you get much more resilient to stress, which means your brain develops a natural defense, and we can observe it on our MRI studies. We see parts of the brain getting thicker physically over 30 days of using the device every day. And that's called resilience in neuroscience, meaning your brain absorbs the external stress or internal stress much better, and then doesn't go in overdrive and consume all this energy when you get a stressful event or even provoked by your own mind sometimes. Then instead of overreacting, it will be you will cruise through it in a much calmer way, and that builds over time. You build more connection in your brain with that.
To be a bit critical here, then I don't know if this has been explored by your team, but it sounds to me like you're giving certain impulses, and then over time it builds like resilience against those impulses. But stress can come from many different impulses. So how are you sure that the impulse that you're giving is transferable to other parts of anxiety?
Then this device is actually not stress inducing at all, to your point. Then you put it on around your ears, you press on the button, it starts a 20-minute session of super gentle vibration you can barely feel. It's not electrical, it's not sending anything through your skin, it's just gently vibrating with very specific pattern on your skin behind your ears. Then what we see is that we are not provoking stress to then the brain to react to it and learn. We are, and why am I saying that, and how are we sure of that? Because when you do an EEG, then we put like a 32 electrodes cap on people, put the vibration behind your ears. When we do that, and we have done that for 900 like EEGs at least, you see the alpha waves in the brain come up regularly from the beginning. And alpha waves are, as you know, very indicative of a restful state. It's typically where you get when you meditate. Then we are not inducing stress, otherwise the alpha wouldn't go up. Then what we do is actually building, it's not exercising the brain to handle stress by stressing it. It's another pathway which actually increase what's called interoception. I won't get into the detail, but this improved interoception makes your brain much more apt to manage stress with other benefits. We have also cognitive. We just did a few studies on memory and concentration and focus. That also increased. Actually, because it's a bigger proposition than just stress. Stress is the most obvious one you feel quickly, including sleep. But it's actually just that your brain being stronger on these around this insular area has a much better ability to read your body and what's happening in your body and then react to it. When you take an example, there are typical examples like eating disorders. Some people who have eating disorders are either never hungry or never feel that they are full. Normally, if you have good interoception, your brain will read your stomach fullness. The stomach has sensors and knows when it's stretched enough to be full. That's how it works. People with low interoception don't read that and keep eating. Or on the contrary, I mean, you have the whole spectrum. then usually all these diseases are due to a low interoception. Our device, and that's what we have proven, but again, it's a little technical, we improve interoception. And by improving interoception, you improve a lot of things. We started by stress and sleep because they were the most obvious, but there are many other benefits in life, especially medical ones, which we are also seeking through an FDA clearance, which come from an improved interoception. Usually, elite athletes, great leaders have high interoception naturally. That's how they can handle all the stress due to their profession. But moreover, especially with athletes, they are very in tune with their body. They can read it. They know, motion, everything, fatigue, management of recovery, all that has to do with interoceptions. And basically, that's an interoceptive tool we have developed, it's a gift which keeps on giving.
So, we had on the previous episode, we had the CEO of Hologenics on. They created this textile to get infrared waves from their body, and then it's like a health device by the FDA clearance. And the reason I'm saying this is he just dedicated I would say half an hour of the podcast to explaining how difficult the FDA process was. Are you guys FDA cleared already on those statements that you were making? Are you in the process? When did you apply? Because apparently it takes very long.
Then it varies. I mean, for a device, for med techs, and for anything which is not molecular and not invasive, it's a different process, which is faster than the molecule. Then that's a good aspect. Then we are in the neurotech field. And the biggest issue that any neuromodulation, neurostimulation technologies and devices have encountered when it comes to FDA clearance, that obviously, and they are right, the FDA requires a study with a sham or a placebo arm, right? You need to compare your active solution to a non-active one. Then, unfortunately, because placebo is so strong when it comes to the brain, we don't understand everything. Even if I give you a hat and tell you this hat is going to make you feel better, most likely you're going to feel better, even if it's just a hat. Then it's very hard, and what defeats most of these technologies ultimately, and it's not about the timing, I will talk about the process next, but is that in the end, the differentiation, the separation between your active data and your sham data are not sufficient for the FDA to clear you. And in neuroscience, in neurotechnology, most of the measures are not hardwired. They are not biometrics. They are purely questionnaires. Then the way, and by the way, a little nuance, then the claims I made today on sleep and stress are exempt from FDA clearance. You can sell a product as long as it's safe through what's called the wellness exemption program of the FDA. And there's a whole list of terms that you can use which don't require. As soon as I talk about anxiety, or if I talk about insomnia, I need an FDA clearance. Then that opens up obviously the prescription market, the reimbursement market, the medical market, which we are not approaching yet. Still waiting for this FDA clearance. And today we are selling a wellness device which can improve stress, sleep, memory, all these things. Doesn't require a medical clearance. That's a nuance. The process itself, well, you first have to, you don't have to, but it's better to ask them if they agree with the protocol you are proposing for your clinical trial. Number of patients, criteria of recruitment, what's your sham versus your active, all these things. Then you go there, that's called a pre-sub. You can submit your pre-sub and they tell you, they will never make a final determination, but they give you advice. Yeah, we probably will agree with that, or no, really, you should do that. Then the first time, we already did a first clinical trial last year and submitted it, and unfortunately we didn't pass at the time because, again, not enough differentiation between sham and active. It's also because we had a sham vibration, which was actually a vibration. Then we are comparing a vibration to another vibration, which in theory was outside of the range of vibration, which could trigger the same process. But when you start vibrating on the skin, whatever you do, something may happen, or again, the placebo effect kicks in. And because it's all based on how people feel because they fill a questionnaire, 10 questions, it's very simple. There's a lot of noise introduced in there. Then we are going back and
but then if I can interrupt, obviously like you have a product and you researched it, but you're making it sound like if I don't know, go to China and pick up some cheap ass like thing for my head on the scam market, which is, by the way, I was in China. It's actually called Chipu Lu, Lu Street. but so it makes it sound like if I would pick up one of those scam articles, and then I just tell people it vibrates and it gives you all of these things, that it will do that, and it will almost have no differentiator to what you're doing.
No, that's true. That's why we are really seeking an FDA clearance, which we are, I think, very likely at this point to get this year because we changed the protocol. Second, we have IP. I mean, that's the best way to protect our specific waveform. And what we know for sure is that our specific waveform versus any other type of gentle, pleasing massage type of thing, which by the way, can work as an acute intervention, meaning if you are stressed now, anything, someone touching your head, someone giving you a hug, putting that on your head, it may help you, absolutely. What it doesn't do is create this resilience over time. But that's not something the FDA is interested in. That's not what they measure. It's not going to modify your brain. It's going to give you a little reassuring boost. Then I'm not saying other solutions don't work. It's not true. Anything can work for like, oh, I'm stressed now. I don't want to pop a Xanax, then I'm going to put that on my head. It's going to help me. For sure, like people use these heavy blankets. People just seek a hug from someone else. All these things have to do with touch, by the way, and work in some extent. But they certainly don't build up these long-term things that we are claiming we do. And we have proven in other ways than the one required to clear the FDA.
And then another question, sorry for that. So I've bought a lot of neuro devices. I have a mini HEG device that helps me with my blood flow in my brain, and I had like infrared, the HeartMath device that measures my like heart frequency, I tried a lot of them. The main thing that I wonder, because these devices were pretty expensive, but have you introduced into your device some type of, I would say like a dopamine hit almost, like every time you wear it something good happens so you want to wear it? Because whenever I did it, and I also did like neurofeedback where I would go to like somebody who has like this proper like 20-30K device set up, and then you get hooked up, and you but with all of them there was never like a want to continue, because it's just like you put it on, you don't feel anything, like you feel something but you don't really feel something, you don't really feel the betterment of it because it's all in your brain, so you don't really like, it just is. It's not like, oh wow, suddenly I can like read 100% faster or something. It's just like, it's like when a child is growing, you don't see the growth unless you're like outside. So how are you addressing the fact that it's not going to become like this other thing that is on my shelf? Have you looked into like making it fun, gamifying? Maybe not, gamifying is also outplayed, I would say, but yeah, have you looked into that?
You summarized perfectly the difficulty to make neurostimulation a thing for the customer market, for the consumer market versus purely clinical. Then the big advantages we have with anything which has attempted to exist before is, first of all, we perform far more research than anybody, and we have really the confidence that it's working. Our technology is very gentle and feels really nice. At least it feels. You feel a very gentle, very pleasing vibration behind your ears that most people, 99% of people, will feel extremely pleasing and not invasive, doesn't force you to like close your eyes or do something else. It's not a big helmet. So form factor is nice. Then that's where I came from my past experience, trying to make it really eliminate all friction on the. Unfortunately, we need a piece of hardware. I would rather not, because hardware is very hard, but we need it, right? We need to vibrate, and we need something. We did it and there's a V2, by the way, coming soon within months, which will be much smaller, much nicer. We learned a lot from V1. But to your point, yes, there is no real, with exceptions for some people, but for most, there is no instant gratification, in the sense that I would say 20 minutes later, these things changed my life. We have 10% of our users who feel, especially on the sleep side, that it changed their life. Then the incentive is still there, and I am one of those. I'm a terrible sleeper. Then I do 2 sessions back to back before bed, my wife as well, and we do that every single night. And I know now I'm after years, but obviously I have skin in the games, and it's easy for me to say, but I feel if I don't have my device, and I know many friends and family and investors who are in the same case, they literally panic because they start having these, which is great for a product to have problem, like if they don't have it, they won't sleep. Then that's a virtuous thing. But for most people who don't really use it enough, meaning 7, 14, 30 days in a row, and as you said, many people do that. They do the first 2 days, 3 days, and they think, ugh, I don't feel it, then I'm going to return it, because we are very generous with that, or put it on a shelf and it's going to catch dust with the rest of your collection. We don't want that. Then obviously that's where software comes into place, and we are adding a lot of features this year. We learned a lot last year. Then we have sensors in the device. We have a heart rate sensor, PPG. We have an accelerometer. Then spend a lot of time on real data from the field, from the first few thousand users out there, with our AI guys, really looking at, is there an indicator based on those 2 measurements which could tell us something during the 20 minutes? Because unless, the Whoop or Oura or whatever, we don't capture data 24/7. We only capture data while you wear the device for 20 minutes. Then it's very limited. And actually, we have a great, what we call the Cove signature. We have a great way now, by combining those and high frequency motion, low frequency, then kind of like trembling motion, every like very fine details. We have the ability to provide you with a graph which will show you if that session was effective and how effective it was on your calmness. We cannot measure sleep, obviously. Sleep is more it's more obvious to people usually, or they can use another device to do that. Then that's the number one. Second, gamification is on the map. With reservation, as you said, we want to overplay it, because my biggest thing when I came into that is that phones are stressful, apps are unnecessary when you use hardware. Why would we impose on top of just relaxing or talking to you or doing what I already do? I don't want to take time off people's already busy days. Then put this device on, turn it on, and go walk your dog, Don't look at an app. Then the gamification will be very optional and offline as much as online, and you don't have to do your session glued to your phone. But you will acquire a system, of merit and points and all that stuff, which always helps and works. But then a combination of biofeedback, which is hard to do, and I think we nailed it at this point, and it's coming out within a month now, plus gamification, plus a lot of education. We see a lot of questions from our users. When shall I wear it? There's no ideal time. Everybody's different, but people want prescription, but not too much. Then we are finding the fine line between over-prescribing and leaving people too free to the point that they are lost. Education, why is it working? What is it really doing to your brain? How do we know? Then we keep adding. But bottom line, yes, it's a tough field to become really, I would say, explosive in the sense that we'll always have the obstacle of people who are not into routines and cannot really find this habit of, at least for a certain number of days, of wearing it every day. They will most likely not feel the benefits, and it's a catch-22. They will not appreciate it.
When is it launched, or when is it launching? And have you guys considered Kickstarter?
No, the product has been on the market for a year already, here in the US, not internationally, but in the US, through our website and Amazon, by the way. Then it's we that's where we got all this data, and live data also for heart rate and motion while people are using the device. And we have loads of data, because everything is connected. We know exactly what people are anonymously are doing with their devices and their apps. Then we have learned a ton over the past 12, now nearly 13 months, and that's where we are we are more confident that there are ways to increase adherence. We have like about 20% of people who keep doing it for after a year, every day because they felt the benefit. We have 10% or so who fell off the cliff very quickly, then they return the device. And it's also because baked in any neuromodulation or neurostimulation technology, we know that there are non-responders. That's kind of statistically, it's known in electrical, electromagnetic, or even a mechanical field. Some people don't react or don't think they react to the technologies, and those we know it's already baked in our like models and return rate. And then in the middle, there is still a big, 70% that we need to convert to more consistent use. Some people come and go. Some people do it 3 times a week and are content with that. Some people stop using after 2 months and just, again, put it on a shelf. Then we are working very hard at keeping them up to the point where they feel really that it changed something. And those are weak signals. Weak signals that sometimes you don't even detect yourself. Your metaphor with children learning, we know. And we know also from learning a foreign language or anything that it's incremental. We know that going to the gym doesn't make you Arnold Schwarzenegger overnight, right? You need a few sessions, many. Then we know that for other things. We also know, but instinctively we don't relate to that supplements, we all take supplements, or most of us take supplements at least at time. It doesn't give us any benefit we can figure.
But I think maybe what the gap is then is what your app could introduce, what all the other apps have not introduced, I find, is actually putting up a progress bar where you can track somehow if there is progress by testing. Maybe like you have a test every 7 days where it's like test out how much you've improved. Like when I do weight loss, right? So I'm losing weight after Christmas. I have a scale from Withings that I have already like 6 years or something. And so I stand on it every morning before, like after shower. And it just goes straight to the Wi-Fi, straight on my app. And I can literally see my weight every single day for the last like 6 years. And so you see like this bar that goes up and down, up and down, up and down, sometimes very much up. But so getting that bar down makes it look super nice for me because it's like a progress bar. I like, oh, look, I see it's happening. And if I zoom out, have you guys looked into creating a progress bar?
Yes. I mean, it's part of like, I wish there was a measure as, recognized and real as weight, unless
but wouldn't that be the innovation to find?
Yeah, and I think we are onto something with that graph I was mentioning based on heart rate and thing. But because it's a brain, nothing replaces EEG, but like including EEG sensors, which would have to be on top of your head in a device, makes it battery technology and invasiveness makes it like, again, a counterproductive thing. And there would be more chances to find a more hardwired measure on EEG because we measure directly the brain. When you measure motion and heart rate, you're already one step removed or more from the origin of your improvements. And that's why we waited for a year with tons of data from users, real data in the field, to see if we have, and we believe we have something. Is it as good as weighing yourself on a scale? Obviously not. But we have the ability now to show your progress during 20 minutes and your progress over time by the shape of this graph will evolve in a way that you get faster to your zone or you improve better from beginning to end, etc. Then we are playing with that. We are testing it. We're going to launch it. It's going to be, as you say, innovative. The other way is to go more like FDA styles, and we would ask a questionnaire every 30 days to users. We know that users don't fill questionnaires and we'll maybe get 20% of them. And it makes the whole app a little heavier, but we have ways to assess your interoception. It's still very subjective and questionnaire based. Yes, if we could like measure your neurotransmitters by taking your saliva, doing this, there are ways where we may, it's not even ever as black and white as weight, may be able to measure better, but it's obviously not it's not user friendly. Then, to your point, absolutely, that the main obstacle for any neurotechnology is how do you measure and provide a progress graph, curve, whatever to your users. That hasn't been done because it's maybe not possible, or if it's possible, it's very hard. And I think we're getting there. Kickstarter, sorry, I never answered that question. You mentioned Kickstarter. We didn't need to do that because we are very well funded. And I had one principle in mind. It's such a difficult technology for us to understand. It's such a new space that yes, Kickstarter could give us some learnings and could have given us money, but that's not what we needed back then. But those learnings, I think we needed to learn in real life. We need to launch this product and really see the reaction of people buying it, using it, much more than in concept, would you like a device which distresses you and makes you sleep better? Because obviously everybody wants it. Then I don't think we'd have learned that much through Kickstarter.
Makes sense. We're actually kind of nearing the end, but before we go there, are there any like other things you'd like to share about the company that I haven't asked?
Well, I mean, people can, even out of curiosity, can go see our website to check the science and all that, because I think it's quite fascinating that something as basic as touch, because it's based on affective touch, which is hardwired in all of us and every large mammal species out there, then which is defined as there is a speed and there is a pressure which are involved. That motion actually triggers that part of the brain I mentioned, insula, because evolutionarily it's assumed that was to create connection between people. It makes you less stressed. It actually does something to your deep brain, which is identified, and you have specific receptors in your skin which are there only to detect that motion, called affective touch. Then that's what we are exploiting, this very human thing which we have been deprived of during COVID and all these things, and it's a big topic on top. It's a very specific type of touch. It's not pressure, it's really motion, low pressure, really has the ability to potentially even cure diseases. Then something that simple that we all know instinctively actually has a scientific foundation. Those receptors have been discovered only a few decades ago. It's pretty recent. We don't even know how they look like in the skin, but they are there. They are nerve endings, and they are directly connected to the insulas and in the preconscious part of the brain. And it's a fascinating world. And our website is feelcove.com, feelcove.com. And we have science pages there, which and we have published scientific studies performed by third parties and peer reviewed, which are, I think, show you like what's happening in the brain. Then,
cool. I like that. Obviously, you kind of did it already, but I usually put out a red carpet. Is there anything you'd like to promote? Where can people find you? Where can people find your products?
Yeah, we can be found in the US now, but soon in Europe. We are already set up. We'll be on Amazon exclusively in the main European markets within 3 weeks, I think, at this point. And we'll be sold there. We are sold on feelcove.com. We are sold on Amazon US as well. Feelcove.com only ships the US today. But again, Europe is coming next, and we are working on some partnerships globally. And the best way to know if this thing works for you is to try it. And we are very generous. We take back product within a long time window because I believe it needs to be tried. But we have changed the life. Some people claim that really of enough people today to know that it's not just a placebo, nice massage tool. It goes beyond, and people around you after a while, which happened to me, tell me you are more patient, you are more things that I don't even notice because it's so incremental over time. And when you get the feedback from others on the improvements you may not even have expected from that, it's quite exciting. Then try it if you can.
I'd definitely review it on my YouTube channel. And I'll actually maybe I'm gonna visit the website and look into the research and maybe try it out. Because it's definitely, so I've had a lot of neuro devices. None of them have actually covered the part that you're mentioning, the affective touch. except my dog, I guess. And so, but that's not as easy. Like, he has always his own opinions when he needs to be cuddled. So I'll definitely check it out. Outside of that, any last words about your story for people listening? We have, young entrepreneurs, investors, people who work corporate who want to switch over maybe, or are thinking about switching over. So very diverse crowd. What are some of the last words about your career and everything you've learned that you'd like to share?
Well, but first of all, I hope my story is not over. I still have a few years to go. I really enjoy what I'm doing, but I would say, for me, I was able to shift from big and well-compensated corporate jobs to a startup because I was at a stage in my life where my kids, I'm a grandfather 3 times already, my kids are grown up. I have maybe less financial needs today for like the short terms. And obviously, when you are in a comfortable corporate position, it's a big deal to move, and what I can say, things take longer than we think. Things are harder than we think most of the time, except if you are very lucky. Then be prepared if you decide to jump ships from corporate to the startup world, to strap up and be patient, and up and downs with desirability with investors, depending on the stage. I mean, it's a bumpy road. We only see obviously the success stories of people going from 0 to 1 billion in the space of 6 months. Those are rare. That's probably not your story. I wish it is, but it's probably not your story.
Well, hopefully one person who listens will be that person. But yeah, it is definitely rare, and you don't see many of those people. I think I would even mention it is even more rare to see people who do the same thing 6 months after you meet them in entrepreneurship. So I would even, put it even more down to that level. How many times I go to networking events and then I go to the next year, the same event, and they're doing completely different things. So it was incredibly inspiring to hear your story of, I would say, how to build a legacy brand, your career, how you went through, science to luxury to startups, and kind of also understanding the difference. We've never had a guest that could explain the difference between these legacy brands and the startup world. So it was very fascinating. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm kind of excited for what other products you guys will be releasing, and yeah, keep going, because I think you have many more years still to go, and I think it's definitely a good idea what you guys are working on. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Laura. It was a pleasure. Have a great weekend.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct